Hello, 594. This is the last one from me, I promise, on survey designs. As I mentioned in a previous video, I teach an entire course on survey design in the summer. So there's literally enough content in this to fill multiple courses. So trying to condense it into a little short module has been a little difficult, but we're making it happen. Okay, so what we're looking at with types and styles of surveys have to do with how we're distributing those surveys and when and who we're distributing it to. You're going to hear in our qualitative module, we're going to talk about interviewing as a way of collecting data. I'm sure what you're used to thinking of whenever I say interview is you're thinking of, Barbara Walters or, Oprah or I'm getting old and I don't know who's on TV right now, but you're thinking of someone on the news or on television who is interviewing somebody else. This is going to be very similar whenever we're doing surveys and when we're doing qualitative, but it's going to be a little different in surveys in how we're using that instrument. So the first choice we're going to make is whether we're going to do that interview or if we're going to use a questionnaire. A questionnaire is what you are probably traditionally thinking of when you think of a survey. A questionnaire and an interview, both of these, a survey interview or a survey questionnaire, are going to differ in who fills out the form. So, in a questionnaire, which is what most of you guys are used to, you're filling out the form. When you do your IDEA course evaluations, you are filling it out yourself. Nobody else is filling it out for you. Nobody is asking you the questions and writing down your responses. You are answering it yourself. Therefore, it is a questionnaire. Anytime you fill out one of those, give us your feedback surveys that comes in your email, questionnaire, right? Interview is a little bit different in that you may still be using that same form, but instead of having the participant fill it out themselves, you're reading the questions to them and documenting their responses to it. Sometimes, if it is a face to face survey and it's kind of complicated, if it's something like, if you answer yes to number 2, go down to question 14. If not, go down to question 6. One of those types of things. We call that skip logic in survey designs. If that's really hard to do on a paper copy, and so if you're interviewing people in a way where you can't do that, or if you're interviewing people, let's just say on the street, or whenever like a polling person calls you on the phone to ask you about who you're voting for and how you feel about certain issues. A lot of times they'll do it that way because somebody asking you something face to face, you're less likely to say no, go away and delete it than you are whenever something shows up in your inbox and you just throw it out. There's also other reasons for it. If it's a complicated survey, as I mentioned, we have ways of doing those online to where the software that we use figures it out for you. So if they answer yes to number 2 and then they're supposed to go to number 14, it takes them straight to number 14. But doing that on a hard copy is pretty difficult. So that might be an example of using an interview. Most of the time, what you're going to see is a questionnaire between these two. One of the things I do want to point out with this has to do with the face-to-face nature of an interview. An interview survey where somebody asks the questions of you and then marks down your answers versus a questionnaire where you're doing it yourself. There are things that people will answer differently if they are able to be anonymous in their response. So if you want to ask someone about, let's say, sexual behavior, they may be more likely to tell you the truth in a questionnaire than they are in a face-to-face interview because of social desirability. They want to give you an answer that you think or that society thinks is acceptable. They don't want to be judged about their answer. If you give them a questionnaire, that judgment's not there. It's an anonymous questionnaire online. The judgment's not there. They're more likely to be honest. That being said, people are so strange, and it's really hard to decipher how people are going to answer things. I've done surveys where we ask people about drug use, and they're more than happy to tell me about every illegal substance that they have used or that they continue to use. But then I'll ask people about their weight, and they don't want to tell me how much they weigh. But they'll tell me about every crime they've ever committed in their life. So it's a little tricky how people respond to things, but when this is part of where your literature review comes in, and from previous studies, they can kind of tell you how people tend to respond to that topic and which method works best. So you would choose between these two. Choice two would be about cross-sectional designs or longitudinal designs. These two have to do with how long are you collecting the data? Or are you collecting just, let's say, today? You just want a snapshot in time. How are people responding? How do people feel about this particular topic at this particular point in time? Or longitudinal, where you want to track how those things change over time. So an example of, most studies are cross-sectional. An example of cross-sectional would be whenever someone calls you and wants to know who you're potentially voting for president, for example. They just kind of want to, quote unquote, take the pulse of the country at this particular point in time. Their goal is to answer a poll and, come up with a number of who they think will win. Longitudinal, we want to track things over time. Longitudinal studies give us more information from the way that just the definition of it, but that comes with a cost in terms of time and resources, and a literal cost in terms of money. So longitudinal studies, even if we want to do them, they're extremely time consuming and they're very expensive. So we tend to do cross-sectional studies. A good example of a longitudinal study is the Mobile study that was actually done here in Alabama by a researcher who is from Birmingham, but I think he worked at UA at the time. And for several years, he tracked different things in the Mobile communities. And his survey talked about all types of things, sense of hope / hopelessness, poverty, just tons and tons of stuff. What he was able to find, because it was longitudinal, he tracked it every single year. He gave the surveys out to this group of people or this community. What he was able to find was these interesting trends on different variables. So, for example, one of the things that he measured was hope or hopelessness. He was working with a lot of low-income communities. And what he noticed was that it stayed pretty stagnant down at the bottom in terms of a sense of hope. And then in 2008, he saw it shoot up. So kind of boring over time, and then it jumps up in 2008. He wouldn't have noticed that pattern over time if he just had 1 year's data. So if he would have done it cross-sectional, he would have just been able to say in 2008, hope looked like blank. In Mobile. We don't know if that's higher than last year or lower than last year. We don't have that data. We just know this is what it looks like right now. Versus longitudinal, he was able to say it was pretty low, and then in 2008, it shot up. And what we know in 2008 is whenever Obama was elected as president, these were low-income communities. They were largely African-American communities. And so because it wasn't cause and effect, we didn't do an experimental design, but the correlation showed that there was a relationship between these different policies that were coming up and having an African American president and a sense of hopefulness going up within this community. So that would be the difference between longitudinal and cross-sectional. Longitudinal could also be the census. The census is given out every 10 years. It's not every year, but it's ongoing. It's every 10 years. And so we can track and in a graph show how demographics in the United States have changed. We can show how income has changed. We can show all of that information because we've collected it multiple times every decade through the census. So these are two things to consider. You'll see some questions about them on the exam. You'll also see it in the self-check for this module. I'm going to stop rambling now because these videos keep getting longer, and my intention is for them to be pretty short. If you have any questions about this, let me know. I'll be happy to work with you on it, and I'll see you guys online.